They were the forgotten ones, the thralls of the Viking world. From the crashing shores of Ireland to the icy fjords of Norway, men, women, and children were captured, condemned, and born into bondage. They toiled in silence, building the wealth of their captors, tending farms, and serving households across Scandinavia. Slavery wasn't a side note of Viking society. It was its backbone. But then came the church, and with it, a seismic shift, the slow unraveling of slavery in the north. So what became of the thralls when their chains were broken? Their journey from property to person is one of the most overlooked transformations in European history. Some vanished. Others fought for a place in a world that had never seen them as equals. And a few, against all odds, rose to power, wealth, and legacy. This is History with Magnus. Subscribe. As a slave or a thrall in the Viking world, manumission was possible. A thrall could purchase freedom or be freed by owner's will, becoming a freedman or woman. Though still under significant legal restrictions, though manumission doesn't seem to have happened too often. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, the Christian church increasingly discouraged slavery and promoted manumission. Church councils and bishops actively encouraged freeing Christian thralls and forbade selling fellow Christians into bondage, laying the groundwork for legal prohibitions that would follow. In Iceland, slavery remained local and small-scale until outlawed by law codes in 1117. Although conversion occurred around 1000 in Norway and Denmark, formal abolition was gradual. Unfree status persisted in law codes into the 13th century, before being eclipsed by feudal-style tenant obligations rather than outright slavery. In Sweden, Christianity became dominant by the late 11th century, but slavery as a legal institution survived until King Magnus Eriksson abolished it in 1335, effectively ending the thrall trade in Swedish lands. Freed thralls weren't really free and occupied an intermediate status. They had personal freedom, but often required their former master's approval for marriage, business dealings, and inheritance matters. In Icelandic and Norwegian law, a freedman's patrimony could still revert to his ex-owner in default, though Danish and Swedish codes, after manumission, more fully integrated them into kin groups rather than into their old master's household. Over time, many former thralls simply remained as unfree or semi-free tenants under obligations resembling serfdom. A serf was a peasant in medieval Europe who was legally bound to work on land owned by a lord. They were not slaves in the way that they couldn't be bought or sold individually, but they had very limited rights and couldn't leave the land without permission. In return for farming the lord's land and paying rent, often in crops or labor, they got protection and a small plot to farm for themselves. Though people were no longer slaves, they were in reality a slave in all but name. But then a terrible disease would change everything for these tenants. Scandinavia was hit hard by the mid-14th century pandemic, but its social aftermath varied sharply across the three kingdoms, and with it the fortunes of those who only a few generations earlier had been thralls. In Norway, an estimated 60 to 65% of the population perished between 1349 and 1350, leaving whole districts depopulated and upending the rural economy. Sweden lost roughly 1/3 of its people, and the kingdom did not recover its pre-plague population until the 17th century. Denmark's mortality figures are poorly documented, but contemporary wills, payment rolls, and deserted farm surveys attest to a similarly severe shock between 1350 and 1352. Across Europe, such mortality produced an acute shortage of labor, and Scandinavia was no exception. In Sweden, nobles tried unsuccessfully to bind peasants into a form of serfdom during the crisis of the 15th century. Peasants instead pressed for mobility and better terms, even selling lands at sharp discounts, because so many properties could hardly be sold for half their worth for lack of people to work them. In Norway, while detailed peasant wage records are scarce, the same logic of supply and demand would have allowed surviving tenant farmers, many of them descendants of freed thralls, to negotiate lighter labor obligations. By contrast, in Denmark, the post-plague shortage prompted a new form of bondage, the vornetskab, legally restricting peasants' movement and reinstating labor dues. So ex-thralls and other peasants there often suffered a loss of freedom rather than a gain. But for some of these poor people, the aftermath of the plague could turn their life completely around. Reminiscences of this can be seen in last names in Scandinavia, where many are named Odegard, which means deserted farm. This means that their family at one point in time took over a farm that had been left vacant because the former owner had died during the plague. Other names connected to this also include Nygard, meaning new farm, and Rud come from the Old Norse word ru, meaning clearing. They often originate from farms that were cleared in forested areas. In other words, newly established settlements on land left by victims of the plague. All of them refer to new settlements or the reclaiming of land after abandonment or disaster. These farms could sometimes be big and have a lot of farmland and woods that could be chopped down and sold. And if the farm was attended properly, it could make you and your descendants very wealthy. In Icelandic sagas, such as Laxdæla Saga or Njál Saga, we see freedmen or descendants of slaves becoming respected figures in their communities, sometimes marrying into chieftain families. They reflect a social reality where smart or ambitious former thralls could rise in status over generations. The Christian Church also provided a rare avenue of upward mobility. Since clergy were often selected for ability rather than birth, sons of freedmen could receive education and rise in the ranks, eventually becoming priests, abbots, or even bishops. In Denmark and coastal Norway, some freedmen or their children settled in growing towns like Bergen, Ribe, or Roskilde, engaging in craft guilds or trade. In Norway, the Bergens Hanseatic trade with northern Germany. A local merchant class included freedmen's descendants who became quite wealthy by the 15th century. Some even joined the city council or served as intermediaries in trade with northern Germany. As part of this broader peasant class, ex-thralls shared in the reshaping of labor relations. Overall, survivors in Sweden, and to a lesser extent Norway, capitalized on higher wages, land access, and weakened noble coercion, while those in Denmark saw their newfound leverage curtailed by serf-like restrictions. Former slaves, now integrated into the peasantry, thus experienced a real improvement in personal and economic freedom in much of Scandinavia, but by no means uniformly. Regional laws and aristocratic responses determined whether the demographic cataclysm translated into a better life or a new form of dependency. What began as the large-scale capture and trade of human property during the Viking era ended in a patchwork of regional legal reforms and the gradual absorption of ex-thralls into the rural, free peasant economy. Remember to subscribe.